What if I told you the real battlefield of the 21st century isn't made of tanks or trenches, but of roads and resources, asphalt, bridges, trade routes? These are the new front lines of global power. And nowhere is that more visible than in Ukraine, where the biggest players on earth, the European Union, the United States, Russia, China, Turkey, and the Gulf states are all fighting for one thing: control of the roads. Because whoever controls the roads controls the future. Welcome to World and Me project with Dr. Yeva Aleksanyan. If you enjoy our videos, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now let's talk about Ukraine. 1,000 years ago, the state of Kievan Rus sat at the crossroads connecting Europe to the Black Sea and the Caspian. Roads then meant survival. They carried salt, furs, and grain. Therefore, wealth, armies, and, of course, this meant power. One famous example: in 1051, Anne of Kiev married King Henry I of France. Was this for love? I doubt. It was geopolitics. By tying families, you tied the roots, therefore wealth. Among those routes, one stood out: the Seversky Donets corridor, running through what today are Kharkov, Luhansk, and Donetsk. Along this river lay the Muravsky and Izyum trails, ancient steppe highways. Whoever held the fords and crossings could tax trade, secure borders, and shape empires. Fast forward to today's war. Geography hasn't changed. The Seversky Donets River Valley still forms a natural east-west barrier. It is still a hard military barrier. Since 2022, Russia has fought intensely here to secure control over roads and bridges, particularly those linking Rostov, Donetsk, Mariupol, and Crimea. East-west highways feeding Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar, and a road rail spine linking Rostov, Donetsk, Mariupol, Melitopol, and Crimea remain the backbone of supply. For Russia, controlling these routes creates a land bridge to Crimea, bypassing the fragile Kerch bridge and securing access to fresh water through the North Crimean Canal. To be clear, this was not the only reason for Russia's invasion, but it was certainly one of the central motives. If Russia loses this corridor, then it will be harder to resupply Crimea. Water shortages in Crimea will reappear. Troop movements will slow, and finally Russia's grip on southeastern Ukraine weakens drastically. For Ukraine, keeping those roads of life open is survival itself. These are the routes that carry food to besieged cities, fuel to keep generators running, ammunition to the front, and grain to the ports that feed the wider world. If those routes are cut, neighborhoods go dark, supermarkets go empty, hospitals run out of supplies. Each convoy that makes it through every bridge still standing is literally the line between a city that endures and a city that falls. So, what are the key routes at stake? First, the land corridor to Crimea. This strip of highway and railway links Russia through southern Ukraine down to Crimea. For Moscow, it's a lifeline. It moves troops and supplies without relying on Kerch Bridge, and it secures Crimea's water and logistics. Without this land bridge, Crimea is vulnerable. With this road, the peninsula is tied firmly to Russia and its war machine. Second, the North Crimean Canal. Water may not sound dramatic, but it is crucial for survival. Before Crimea's annexation in 2014, the canal supplied nearly 85% of Crimea's fresh water. After the annexation of Crimea, Ukraine built a dam across the canal, cutting off the flow and leaving Crimea parched. Crimea had to rely on more expensive sources of water. In 2022, Russian forces blasted it open again. Control of this canal is about whether Crimea is livable, whether farms grow food and cities have running water. Third routes at stake in this war are Black Sea shipping lanes. Ukraine is one of the world's great bread baskets. Its wheat and corn feed not only Europe but also Africa and Middle East. When those shipping lanes are blocked, bread prices rise from Cairo to Johannesburg. A UN Turkey brokered deal once allowed safe passage for over 30 million tons of grain, but Russia pulled out. Since then, Ukraine has tried risky alternatives, but each voyage is in a way a gamble. Insurance costs soar, and ships face missile threats. These sea lanes are not just Ukraine's export routes, they are arteries of global food security. And finally, the rails and roads of Donbas and South. Rails and highways connect inland Ukraine, Donbas, Dnipro, Kharkov, to ports like Mariupol, Berdyansk, Kherson, Mikhailov, and Odesa. Heavy industry, coal, steel, machinery depend on these routes. For Ukraine, they are vital for moving exports and keeping factories tied to global markets. For Russia, they mean access to industry, resources, and stronger routes to Crimea and beyond. If Moscow holds them, it gains enormous leverage over Ukraine's economy and possibly even its government. These routes also expand further. Roads and rails in the south connect Russia to Crimea and then to Transnistria in Moldova, creating a continuous land corridor along the Black Sea coast. So for Ukraine, defending these routes is about survival. For Russia, seizing them is a strategic prize, tying together all the territories it wants under its control. When this war ends, whoever holds the land bridge, the canal, the sea lanes, and the rail networks will shape Ukraine's future and the balance of power in the entire region. Well, so far in the video, I've talked about routes that are crucial to Russia, but there are other big players in this war, and they too are interested in routes that run through Ukraine. So, what are their interests? Let's start with European Union. For the European Union, Ukraine's roads are critical. Western Ukrainian highways through Lviv, Volyn, Transcarpathia, and Chernivtsi connect directly to Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Romania. Along these routes travel the trucks carrying grain, steel, coal, and metals straight into European markets. Think about that. The E40 highway from Kiev to Poland and E50 highway through the Carpathians aren't just roads, they're Europe's economic arteries. After the war began, Brussels didn't wait. Ukraine was added to 10T, Europe's Trans-European Transport Network, which is the grand plan that links the continent through modern highways, high-speed rails, and ports. Why was that so important? Because joining 10T wasn't just a technical step. It was a strategic signal. It meant Europe began to treat Ukraine not as a buffer zone, but as part of its future infrastructure map. Every rail line, every highway or logistics hub upgraded under 10T funding draws Ukraine physically and economically closer to European Union. The consequences are big. Ukraine's main roads and railways are now being designed to match European standards, literally connecting it into the European Union's supply chains. This opens the door for billions in European investments once the war stabilizes. Each effort undercuts Russia's aim to isolate Ukraine. Instead, with such move, Kiev is tied to Europe's arteries of trade, transport, and recovery. Having this in mind, it is not surprising that adding Ukraine to European 10T was followed by Solidarity Lanes Initiative, a massive program funding new border crossings, rail hubs, and highways. Since the beginning of the war, the European Union has mobilized over 2 billion euros, and by 2030, it has pledged nearly 4.45 billion euros in investments just into roads and logistics corridors. Why? Because these roads are overloaded, but absolutely essential. So now, how about United States? In which routes is Washington interested and why? For the United States, two corridors matter the most. The Kiev-Odesa route, running south to the Black Sea, and stretching west towards Poland and NATO's logistics base in Eastern Europe. At first glance, these might look like ordinary trade highways, but they're not just about commerce. They're about connection and survival. The Kiev-Odesa corridor is Ukraine's economic artery to the sea. Through it flow grain exports, metal shipments, and energy supplies. The very goods that feed global markets and stabilize food prices from Africa to Asia. When that corridor is open, Ukraine earns revenue and global prices stay manageable. When it is blocked, everyone feels it, from rising bread prices in Cairo to grain shortages in Istanbul. The Kiev-Lviv route, on the other hand, is the West's lifeline into Ukraine. It carries not only trade but military aid, humanitarian convoys, fuel, and reinforcements. This is why for the United States, helping Ukraine isn't about more than supporting an ally. It's about protecting the entire architecture of European trade and security. If these roads fail, Ukraine risks being cut off from the West, and NATO's eastern flank becomes far more vulnerable. That's why the United States and the European Union have poured funding into maintaining and repairing them. Bridges, rail junctions, fuel depots, all the invisible logistics that keep a modern war effort and a modern economy running. They're civilian lifelines, yes, but also military supply chains. They carry both grain and ammunition, humanitarian aid, and defense systems. If Ukraine's connections to Europe collapses, the continent doesn't just lose a partner, it loses a bridge. Without Ukraine's trade and transport routes, Europe would have to rely more on corridors that pass through Russia or on China's Belt and Road networks. That means depending on those powers' infrastructure, pricing, and political goodwill, effectively handing them leverage over Europe's economy. And that matters for America too. If Europe becomes more dependent on Russia and China, the United States could lose influence and key trade opportunities in the region as markets, contracts, and infrastructure projects drift eastward towards Moscow and Beijing. A weaker, more dependent Europe also becomes less secure and less self-sufficient. That puts more burden on Washington to defend and stabilize NATO's eastern flank. In other words, a Europe that is economically cornered and insecure eventually becomes a burden, a heavier cost for America to carry, and the United States would suffer economically if that happened. By keeping Ukraine connected through the Lviv and Kyiv, Odesa corridors, the United States is essentially investing in European self-reliance, self-sufficiency, ensuring that the entire alliance doesn't crumble under pressure. There's another reason too. Ukraine's reconstruction, its roads, ports, and railways could open a new frontier for American investment in logistics, energy, technology, agriculture, and most importantly, mining. Ukraine's vast mineral wealth. I'll talk about that in my next video because this is where Ukraine's value to the United States becomes even clearer. If Ukraine succeeds, American companies gain a foothold in a region rich in resources and close to both European and Asian markets. If it fails, if those resource-rich corridors are lost, that opportunity shifts to China and Russia, who will shape Eurasia's infrastructure and manufacturing instead. That's why the United States cares not only out of principle, but out of pragmatism. Now let's talk about another big player, China. China sees roads through a very different lens as part of its grand project, the Belt and Road Initiative, or the New Silk Road, that aims to connect Asia to Europe through a vast network of highways, railways, and ports. Before the war, Beijing was investing heavily in Ukraine. Chinese companies were expanding terminals at Odesa's port, building logistics and road infrastructure near Kiev, Kharkiv, and the Dnipro region. The idea was simple: make Ukraine a logistic bridge, a gateway for Chinese goods entering the European market faster and cheaper than through Russia or Turkey. But when Russia invaded Ukraine, that dream froze. Contracts were suspended. The land route that was supposed to link Chinese factories to European consumers turned into a battlefield. But Beijing is waiting and continuing to see Ukraine as the missing piece in its global puzzle, a corridor that could one day revive its Silk Road's dream. So you might ask, rightfully, if Ukraine is such an important missing piece in China's global puzzle, and if Beijing's growth depends on keeping exports flowing smoothly to Europe through Ukrainian routes, then why does China support Russia's war efforts? Because here's the paradox. When the war disrupted Ukraine's roads and ports, it also disrupted China's own logistic networks. Right. Not as severely as Russia's, but enough to slow the Belt and Road momentum in Europe. And yet, instead of pushing for peace, Beijing chose to back Moscow, buying its oil, supplying goods, and giving the Kremlin economic oxygen. We all know that the only person today who could truly stop this war is not Donald Trump, it's Xi Jinping. China alone has the leverage to make Russia pause to stop the war. But for now, Xi Jinping chooses not to stop Putin. Why? Because a bleeding Europe, an isolated Russia, and an exhausted America all serve China's long game. The longer this war lasts, the weaker the West becomes. China knows that and benefits from it. Beijing gains every time the West is distracted, divided, or exhausted. Russia's invasion forces the United States and Europe to pour billions into defense, humanitarian aid, and energy realignment. Money and focus that might otherwise have gone towards Asia, where China wants room to expand. At the same time, China wants a weaker, more dependent Russia, one that relies on Beijing for trade, energy, sales, and technology. Sanctions have pushed Moscow straight into China's arms, giving Beijing discounted oil, control over key supply chains, and growing influence in Siberia. Perhaps no direct control, but certainly economic dominance. So, since the beginning of the war, when people have asked me who I think is winning this war, Ukraine or Russia, my answer has always been China. Because China will come out of it with a weakened Russia, a drained Europe, and a distracted America. No matter who wins on the battlefield, Beijing gains on the global chessboard. Besides, China is watching and learning. The Ukraine war is a live case study in Western sanctions, weapon logistics, and information warfare, and alliance behavior. Every reaction, from sanctions to supply chain management, helps China model what could happen if it ever faces confrontation over Taiwan. Supporting Russia economically by buying cheap energy, trading goods, or providing dual-use technology, China's ultimate goal is not a single road. It's an entire Eurasian system where trade, finance, and technology flow through Beijing-led infrastructure and not Western ones. If Ukraine eventually becomes part of a post-war reconstruction project and China can buy in, it gains a foothold in rebuilding ports, highways, rail lines, and possibly even mining sectors rich in lithium and rare earths. That's why China remains cautious, not confrontational. It doesn't want to fully destroy Ukraine, but it certainly wants to weaken and have access to it later for much bigger gains. So this is about China. Of course, there are other smaller players in this game too, players such as Turkey and Gulf states. For Turkey and the Gulf countries, roads mean one thing: food. From Odesa to the Danube ports of Ismail, these routes carry Ukrainian grain to Turkey and onward to Persian Gulf, feeding millions. This is why Turkey co-brokered the Black Sea Grain Corridor and why Gulf investors have poured money into Ukraine's agriculture and logistics. When Russia blocks ships in the Black Sea, these southern road routes become the alternative, overloaded, risky, but absolutely vital for food security in those regions. This is the World at Me project with Dr. Yeva Aleksanyan. If this helps you to see the world a little more clearly, like, share, and tell me in the comments. Who do you think will control the roads of the future? Let's discuss.